Nobody talked about it openly, not for years, but every soldier who was on that field knew exactly what they had seen. March 8, 1972. The city of Fort Hunter Liggett, a U.S. Army training base carved into the California hills. Open field, dry grass, cold morning light. Wednesday, 8:45 a.m. Bruce Lee was there as a guest. No uniform, no rank, no introduction beyond his name. Most men on that field had never heard of him. Commander Dale Harwick certainly hadn't. 6'2", 240 pounds, 19 years of military service. A man who had never, not once, been made to feel small. That was about to change. What Harwick didn't know, the quiet man across the field had ended confrontations before they began. What Harwick didn't understand, everything he believed about size and strength, was about to be tested. What nobody on that field realized, they were about to witness something none of them could explain for decades. Harwick looked across the field, saw a lean figure, 5'7", still, calm. He walked over, said 7 words, and changed the next 4 minutes of his life forever. This is what happened that morning. March 8th, 1972. 7:15 a.m. Captain Raymond Voss had been planning this for 6 weeks. He commanded the 1st Infantry Division's Combat Readiness Unit, and he had a problem. His soldiers were strong, disciplined, aggressive, but their hand-to-hand training was rigid, predictable. Voss had watched too many drills where size always won, yet where the biggest man walked away every time. He believed that was a dangerous lesson for real combat. Voss had seen something in his soldiers that scared him. Not weakness, rigidity. The kind of rigidity that gets men killed when the situation changes and the training doesn't. So he made a call. He had connections in the film industry, a colleague who knew people, and that colleague knew Bruce Lee. The agreement was simple. Bruce would come to the base, observe, demonstrate if willing. No pressure. No formal program. Just a morning on the field. What Voss didn't plan, Commander Dale Harwick would be running drills on the same field that morning. What Voss didn't anticipate, Harwick would take one look at the civilian guest and decide something needed to be proven. What Voss couldn't have known, the next 91 seconds would do more for his soldiers than 6 months of standard training. Sergeant Eddie Pruitt, Harwick's top student, was already on the field by 7:45. Dr. Margaret Ellis, the base physician, had arrived for routine observation. Private First Class Danny Cho, the youngest soldier in the unit, stood near the equipment shed. None of them knew what the morning would become. But who was Commander Dale Harwick? To understand what happened on that field, you need to understand the man first. Dale Robert Harwick was 42 years old, 6'2", 240 pounds, not the kind of weight that slows a man down, the kind that moves through things. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles. A faint scar ran along his left jaw. Shrapnel, not a blade, though he never corrected anyone who assumed otherwise. He had pale gray eyes that didn't blink often. Men noticed that. He had enlisted at 18. Straight out of a small town in rural Ohio where his father worked the railroad and his mother worked everything else. No money, no connections, no plan beyond getting out. The Army gave him structure. USA and Korea gave him something else entirely. He arrived in 1953 at the tail end of the war. Young, wide, full of the kind of confidence that hasn't been tested yet. His unit was ambushed near Heartbreak Ridge on a cold October morning. Communications cut, 3 men down, no backup coming. What happened next became the story Harwick told once, and only once, to a group of new recruits in 1968. He had picked up 2 injured men and carried them through half a mile of contested ground. The 3rd man he had dragged. His size had saved them. His aggression had cleared the path. No technique, no training manual, Just weight and will and the refusal to stop moving. He came back from Korea believing something completely. Size is not an advantage. Size is the advantage. Everything else, the footwork, the angles, the philosophy, was decoration. Decoration that got men killed when real pressure arrived. He spent the next 11 years turning that belief into a curriculum. Now, his program at Fort Hunter Liggett was the most physically demanding unarmed combat course in the division. Soldiers who passed it walked differently. Soldiers who failed it didn't forget why. His record was clean in a specific way. In 11 years of teaching, no student had ever beaten him in a demonstration. No visiting instructor had walked away without learning something about humility. No man his own size had made him retreat. He was proud of that. In the quiet way a man is proud of something he bled to build. What nobody knew about Harwick was how much of his identity lived inside that record. It wasn't ego. It was the only proof he had that Korea had meant something. That size really was the answer. He needed that to be true. So when Sergeant Pruitt mentioned at 8:30 a.m. that Captain Voss had brought a civilian martial arts consultant onto the field, Harwick didn't say anything. He just looked across the grass, saw the lean figure near the equipment line. 5'7", maybe 140 pounds, black training clothes, standing still. Harwick understood something immediately. He thought it was an insult. What Harwick didn't understand, it wasn't an insult at all. What Harwick couldn't have known, that quiet figure had already walked away from situations that would have hospitalized most men on that field. What this detail would matter would become clear in exactly 17 minutes. He rolled his shoulders, told Pruitt to keep the unit warming up, and walked across the field. The grass was still damp. Morning fog had mostly lifted, but a thin haze sat low over the hills to the west. Someone's radio played faintly from the equipment shed. Normal sounds. A normal morning. Harwick covered the distance in long, unhurried strides. Bruce Lee watched him come. Didn't move. Didn't shift his weight. Just watched. To Harwick, this was a civilian who needed a lesson in where he was standing. To Bruce, this was a walk he had taken before. Different field. Same direction. Or so to Danny Cho watching from the equipment shed. Something felt wrong about the size of the gap between them. Not the physical gap. The other kind. Harwick stopped 4 feet away. He looked down. And that detail mattered, because he always had to look down. And said, "You the one Voss brought to teach?" Bruce held his gaze. "I'm here to demonstrate. Your men teach themselves." Harwick's jaw tightened slightly. Pruitt noticed it from 30 yards away. He had seen that jaw tighten before. It never ended quietly. Behind him, Private Danny Cho leaned toward the soldier beside him. "That civilian," Cho said quietly. "I've seen his face somewhere." The other soldier squinted across the field. "Some TV show, maybe." Cho looked again. He wasn't sure. He said nothing more. "Demonstrate what exactly?" Harwick said. Not a question. A challenge dressed as one. "Whatever's useful," Bruce said. Harwick took 1 step closer. The distance between them was now less than 3 feet. "My men need to understand real combat," Harwick said. "Not demonstrations, not philosophy, real combat." He let that land, then added, "You want to be useful? Show me something real." Oh, the field went quiet. Even the radio from the shed seemed to fade. Private First Class Danny Cho, standing near the equipment line, stopped moving entirely. He would remember this moment 40 years later with complete clarity. What Cho noticed, that nobody else mentioned later, was that Bruce Lee didn't look at Harwick's hands. He looked at his feet. That detail. Cho wouldn't understand what it meant until years later. Bruce Lee looked at Harwick for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." 2 words. No aggression, no performance, just agreement. And that, somehow, was more unsettling than anything else he could have said. To Harwick, it meant the civilian didn't understand what he was agreeing to. To Voss, watching from 40 yards, arms crossed, It meant something had already been decided. He just didn't know by whom. Harwick pulled off his jacket, handed it to Pruitt without looking back. The field became a ring without anyone drawing a line. "Everything you've heard so far?" That was the setup. What happened in the next 3 minutes became the story these men carried for the rest of their lives. This is how it unfolded. Harwick moved first. No warning, no circling. He stepped in hard and grabbed both hands, aiming for Bruce's collar and left arm. The grip that had controlled every man he'd ever put on the ground. He caught air. Bruce had moved, not backward, sideways, a single step, maybe 18 inches to the right. Harwick's hands closed on nothing. His momentum carried him forward 6 inches more than he intended. He reset, fast, faster than a man his size should move. Reached again, this time lower, going for the waist, a takedown. Bruce redirected the grip. Not blocked, redirected. Now his left hand met Harwick's right forearm and turned it, just slightly, enough that Harwick's weight went to the wrong angle. Harwick stumbled one step, caught himself. Sergeant Pruitt exhaled through his nose. He'd watched Harwick train for 6 years. He had never seen him stumble. Harwick's first doubt arrived. Small, quiet. He buried it immediately. Size always wins when it commits fully, Harwick thought. He hadn't committed fully yet. That was the explanation. He came in again, lower. Faster, both arms wrapping. This time he connected. Both arms locked around Bruce's midsection. Full grip, full weight behind it. He drove forward. The sound was a dull impact, like a sandbag absorbing a throw. They hit the ground together. Harwick on top, 240 pounds of trained military muscle in full control. He shifted his weight, locked position, pressed down with his forearm across Bruce's chest. Dr. Margaret Ellis, standing 20 feet back, took one step forward instinctively. Yes, Captain Voss went completely still. Pruitt thought, "That's it." Harwick thought, "I've got him." 6 seconds. Bruce Lee didn't panic, didn't struggle. His right hand found Harwick's left elbow, his left foot repositioned. A small movement, almost invisible. He wasn't trying to push Harwick off. He was changing the geometry. On the 7th second, Harwick felt his base shift. Not from force, from angle. His left knee had nowhere to go. His weight, the thing he trusted most, became the problem. Bruce moved underneath him like water finding a gap. In less than 2 seconds, the position reversed. Harwick was on his back. Bruce's knee was at his shoulder. One hand controlled Harwick's right arm at the wrist and elbow. Light pressure. Absolute control. Like fingertips that couldn't be removed. Harwick tested it once. His shoulder sent a sharp message. He stopped. The field was completely silent. That silence. Doctor. Ellis would describe it 20 years later as the loudest thing she ever heard on a training field. "Whenever you're ready," Bruce said quietly. 91 seconds. That's how long it lasted. The fight was over. Bruce stood, stepped back. Harwick lay on the cold grass for a moment, then got up. Story done. Except Harwick didn't take the hand Bruce offered. He picked up his jacket from the ground, turned to Voss. "Who is he?" Voss paused for just a moment. "Bruce Lee." The name landed. Harwick's expression didn't change. Then something moved behind his eyes. Green Hornet. The films. That actor. His jaw tightened and then released because the next thought arrived immediately. That was no actor. What he had felt on the ground. That control, that angle, that absolute certainty. No actor does that. He looked back across the field. Bruce Lee was already walking toward Voss, calm, unhurried, like nothing had happened. Harwick stood for a long moment with his jacket in his hand, then walked back toward his unit without a word. As no footage exists of that morning, but 4 witnesses gave consistent accounts across 5 decades. None of them contradicted each other, not once. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. Pruitt didn't move. Danny Cho hadn't breathed properly in 91 seconds. Dr. Ellis lowered her hand slowly. Captain Voss walked toward Bruce. The field smelled like damp grass and cold morning air. Someone's boot scuffed the ground. That was the only sound. To Pruitt, what he had just seen was a technical problem. Something in Harwick's base, something about angle. He would spend 3 days trying to identify it. To Dr. Ellis, what she had just seen was a medical question. How had a 140-pound man controlled a 240-pound man without a single visible impact? She had no category for it. To Danny Cho, what he had just seen was something else entirely. He was 22 years old, Korean-American. The youngest man in the unit. He had grown up watching men like Harwick his whole life. Men who led with size. Men who won because of it. What he had just seen was the first time that equation had failed in front of him. He didn't have words for what it meant yet. He would. Bruce stood where he had stood at the end, calm, not performing calm, actually calm. Voss reached him and said quietly, "You all right?" "Fine," Bruce said. Then, "He's good, very good." Voss glanced toward Harwick's retreating back. "He won't see it that way." "Not yet," Bruce said. 2 words. Danny Cho, standing close enough to hear, felt something shift in his chest. Not yet. He didn't fully understand them that morning. He would. Pruitt watched Harwick reach the far side of the field and stop. Just stop. Standing with his back to everyone. Looking at the hills. Pruitt had served under Harwick for 6 years. He had seen him absorb bad news. Seen him absorb physical pain without expression. He had never seen him stand still like that, yet like a man trying to locate something he'd dropped. What Harwick was feeling in that moment wasn't anger. What Harwick was feeling was the ground moving under a building he'd spent 19 years constructing. He didn't want an explanation. Not from the man who'd just put him on the ground. Not today. Years later, Sergeant Eddie Pruitt would say, "I've seen men lose fights. I've seen men lose badly. What I saw in Harwick that morning was different. He didn't just lose a fight. He lost an argument he'd been having with himself for 20 years. 11:47 p.m. Harwick's quarters. Fort Hunter Liggett. The base had gone quiet 3 hours ago. He sat at his desk, one lamp on, a glass of water untouched beside it. His right shoulder ached in a specific way. Not from injury, from the memory of the position. He kept returning to the same moment, the moment his weight became the problem. Not a strike, not a technique he didn't recognize, his own weight. Yes, the thing he had relied on for 19 years. The thing that had carried 2 injured men through half a mile of contested ground in Korea. He had run his curriculum through his mind a dozen times since the field. Looking for the flaw, looking for what he had done wrong. He had replayed the takedown, clean execution, full grip, correct angle. He had replayed the ground position, proper weight distribution, forearm across the chest, textbook control. So just the honest answer kept arriving, and he kept setting it aside. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had done everything right, everything he had taught for 11 years. And it hadn't been enough. That was the part he couldn't locate a drawer for. Not the loss, the reason for it. He thought about the moment his base shifted, not from force, from angle. The man hadn't pushed him, hadn't muscled him. He had simply moved in a way that made Harwick's position wrong. Shai made his commitment, the thing he had always called his greatest advantage, into the thing that trapped him. Harwick didn't have a category for that. He went back to his desk, opened the small journal he kept in his top drawer. He used it rarely, for things that couldn't be said out loud. He wrote 4 words. He crossed them out, wrote them again, then closed the journal without finishing the thought. Those 4 words, what they were, wouldn't become clear until 14 months later. The answer wouldn't come on that field. It would come in the mess hall. On a morning, he wasn't expecting it. 3 days later, March 11th, 9:20 a.m. The story was already moving through the base, not loudly. The Army doesn't do things loudly unless it has to, but in the mess hall, in the corridors between buildings, in the brief silences between drills, men talked. By the second day, the story had acquired details nobody present could verify. By the third day, someone was claiming Bruce Lee had thrown Harwick 10 feet. Pruitt heard that version and said nothing. Yes, Danny Cho heard it and shook his head. Cho had been there. He knew what the 10-foot version was doing, making the story comfortable. What actually happened? A 140-pound man redirecting a 240-pound man using nothing visible. That version made people uncomfortable. So they changed it. The real version was quieter and somehow harder to believe. Captain Voss received 2 separate requests that week from other unit commanders. Both wanted to know if the civilian consultant was available for additional sessions. Voss said he would ask. Voss had seen something in his soldiers that scared him. Not weakness, rigidity, the kind that turns good men into predictable ones. He had brought Bruce Lee to crack that rigidity open. He hadn't expected Harwick to be the one it cracked first. What Voss didn't know, Harwick had already made a decision. He had gone looking for Bruce Lee on March 11th. Now, he found him in the small gymnasium on the east side of the base where Voss had arranged a secondary session. Harwick stood in the doorway for a moment. Bruce was working alone. Movement drills, unhurried. The gymnasium smelled like old rubber mats and chalk dust. A single overhead light, concrete walls. Harwick walked in. Bruce stopped. They looked at each other. What passed between them in that moment? Neither man described it the same way. Harwick said, "I need to understand what you did with my weight." Not, "I want to train with you." Not, "Teach me your style." Specifically, what you did with my weight. Bruce considered that for a moment, then said, "Your weight was never the problem. Your commitment to it was." Harwick stood with that, didn't like it, didn't dismiss it either. "Show me," he said. That session lasted 2 hours. No audience, no witnesses except the empty gymnasium. What happened in those 2 hours, neither man described in detail to anyone. But Pruitt noticed something different in Harwick's drills the following week. Something small, something that would take 6 more weeks to fully understand. Most versions of this story end here. But Harwick didn't learn the lesson everyone thinks he learned. What he actually took from that field took 14 months to fully arrive. And when it did, it started with 4 words he couldn't finish writing. 6 weeks later, April 19th, 7 a.m. Morning drills, same field. Harwick stood in front of his unit. Same voice, same presence, same weight. But the drill he ran that morning was different in one specific way. For 11 years, his ground defense curriculum had one core principle: use your size to control position. That morning, he added a second principle: your size is only useful if you understand its limits. He demonstrated it himself. He got on the ground, voluntarily, in a disadvantaged position, and showed his soldiers how to move from there. Pruitt watched from the side. He had never, in 6 years, seen Harwick put himself in a position of disadvantage in front of his unit. Danny Cho was in the front row. He recognized immediately what he was watching. It wasn't the technique that was new. It was the honesty. Harwick was showing his soldiers something he hadn't known 3 weeks ago. He was teaching the gap in his own curriculum. He ran it 3 times. The first time, soldiers watched politely. The second time, they started asking questions. The third time, Harwick made Pruitt demonstrate the counter. Pruitt ended up on his back in 11 seconds. The unit went quiet, in the way that means people are learning. Not embarrassed, quiet. Thinking, quiet. Harwick stood up, dusted off his knee, said, "The man who knows only his strength is half prepared. The man who knows his strength and its limits, that man is dangerous." Nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to. What none of them knew, that line had come from 2 hours in a gymnasium. From a man who said it quietly and moved on. By April, 3 of Harwick's top students had won engagements in sparring sessions against men significantly larger, using the new principle. Using the gap Harwick had found, or rather had been shown. He didn't tell them where it came from. He didn't need to. Pruitt knew. Danny Cho knew. Dr. Ellis, who heard about the changes through Voss, knew. What none of them fully understood yet was how permanent the change would be. Harwick made one phone call to Captain Voss in late April, asked if there was a way to get a message to the civilian consultant. Voss said he'd try. He never confirmed whether the message was delivered. But Bruce Lee was back in the city of Los Angeles by then, working, teaching, building something larger than any single demonstration. What he took from that morning on the field, nobody knows. What Harwick took was still unfolding. Harwick made his decision. Bruce continued his work. Most people think that's where it ended. It wasn't. July 20th, 1973, Harwick heard the news in the mess hall. 10:14 a.m. He was eating alone. The radio on the counter was playing something he wasn't listening to. Then the announcement. He set down his fork, sat very still. The man across the table, a young corporal he didn't know well, noticed and said nothing. Harwick's coffee went cold. He stayed at that table for 22 minutes after he finished eating, not thinking about the field, not thinking about the 91 seconds, thinking about the gymnasium. 2 hours. Empty room. No audience. The patience of a man who could have dismissed him, who had every reason to dismiss him, and hadn't. He thought about the 4 words in his journal, the ones he had written and crossed out and written again. He finally understood why he hadn't been able to finish the sentence. Because the sentence wasn't finished yet. It had taken 14 months to complete. He went back to his quarters. Opened the journal, found the page, the 4 words he had written. I was half prepared. Underneath, in different ink, 14 months later. Now I teach the other half. He never showed it to anyone. But Pruitt, who had known Harwick for 6 years, said he seemed different after that day. Not softer, clearer, like a man who had finally located the thing he'd dropped. Years later, Dr. Margaret Ellis would say, I watched a lot of men process hard things in my time on that base. Harwick was different. He didn't grieve quickly. He grieved accurately. He knew exactly what he'd lost. 1987. Dale Harwick was 57 years old. He had retired from active service in 1981. He was teaching now, privately, in a converted garage in Fresno, to a small group of students, mostly veterans. Some young men from the neighborhood, nobody famous, nobody paying much. He didn't advertise. Word moved the way it always does in small communities. One of his students, a former Marine named Carl Dietz, had driven 3 hours to train with him after hearing the story secondhand. He had heard it wrong, of course. The version he'd heard involved Bruce Lee throwing Harwick through a fence. Harwick corrected him on the first day. Nothing dramatic, he said. 91 seconds. He put me on the ground. I got up. Dietz waited. That's it? That's it, Harwick said. Everything else happened after. He ran Dietz through the same curriculum he'd been building since 1972. Quietly rebuilt from the ground up in the years since. The core principle hadn't changed, but it had expanded. It now started with one question Harwick asked every new student on their first day. What do you think your greatest advantage is? Whatever they answered, he spent the next session showing them the limit of that advantage. Not to break their confidence, to build something more accurate in its place. Carl Dietz, years later, would describe Harwick's teaching as the most honest instruction I ever received. He didn't teach you what you wanted to hear. He taught you what you needed to find out. Danny Cho, who had stayed in contact with Harwick sporadically over the years, visited the Fresno garage in 1989. He watched a session from the side. Afterwards, he and Harwick sat outside in the late afternoon. Cho asked, "Do you think he knew that morning what it would lead to?" Harwick was quiet for a moment. Then, I think he knew what he was doing. I don't think he knew what I'd do with it. That part was mine. Cho nodded. They sat for a while without talking, the way men do when something has already been said completely. To Cho, that answer was the whole story. Not the 91 seconds, not the gymnasium. That part was mine. A decorated commander choosing at 42 to pick up something new. Years later, Danny Cho, retired, a grandfather, a guy living in Sacramento, would tell this story to his youngest grandson. Not the fight part, the part after. His grandson asked him once, "What do you remember most?" "Not the takedown," Cho said. "I remember that he looked at Harwick's feet, not his hands. His feet." How the grandson waited. Hands tell you what a man is doing. Feet tell you what he's committed to. Bruce Lee didn't need to know what Harwick was doing. He already knew what Harwick couldn't change. He would also say, "The most dangerous thing a strong man can do is believe his strength is the whole answer. The moment he stops looking for the rest of the answer, that's when he becomes easy to beat. And the moment he starts looking again, that's when he becomes worth learning from." 91 seconds. That's how long the confrontation lasted. The lesson lasted the rest of Dale Harwick's life, and the lives of every soldier, student, and man who trained under him after. Yet real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just changes the geometry and waits for you to understand why.